What is the GST and why would anyone other than a politician think it's a good idea to pay more of it? GST stands for Goods and Services Tax, and that's how much it will bring in this financial year. Not bad considering the rate is only 10%, fourth lowest of the 33 advanced economies in the OECD. It's a tax on spending, which makes it different to the nation's chief revenue raiser, income tax, which will net this much from workers and this much from businesses. So what's the history of the GST? It was first proposed by Paul Keating in the 80s, but unions and his then boss, Labor PM Bob Hawke, weren't keen. In 1993, Liberal opposition leader John Hewson vowed to bring in a GST if he won the election, but in a TV interview he couldn't explain how it would apply to a birthday cake. He lost. It was, however, the conservative side of politics that eventually got the GST across the line in 1999. Australia was one of the last big economies to impose a GST. That was part of then Treasurer Peter Costello's pitch, that it was time to bring in what other countries call a VAT, value-added tax, or consumption tax, so Australia could ditch the wholesale sales tax system, which, he said, only Swaziland and the ALP still thought was a good idea. The GST doesn't apply to everything. To get the Senate votes needed to bring it in, Costello and Howard agreed to leave out fresh food and services such as health and education. This is because the GST is considered regressive, which means it hits lower income households harder. Exempting these three areas alone costs that much. So if it's regressive, why would anyone except a politician want to raise the GST? Economists say the GST is a better form of tax than income tax and some of the state levies and duties we pay. For example, high marginal income tax rates increase the incentive to dodge or minimise tax. But what about the GST being regressive? Well, that can be countered through tax cuts and welfare increases, proponents say. How much extra money could be raised through an increased GST? Bump it up to 15% and remove all the exemptions, and revenue would lift by more than $250 billion over 4 years, accountants say, of which $170 billion could be spent shielding the poor. But what's the downside then? If we let politicians plug a gap with a GST increase, how long do you think it will be before they seek to do so again? Is there any protection against that? Well, yes, because all states and territories have to agree to the changes. It's thought that any attempt to increase that didn't have community support would be opposed by whichever premier was about to go to the polls. So while collecting additional revenue through the GST can be done in a way that benefits the nation and shields the vulnerable, think carefully about giving politicians anything more to play with, because as the late Kerry Packer famously said, governments don't spend it that well that we should be donating extra.